Welcome to Beat Diabetes. We're going to continue to look at Gary Taubes' amazing book, Rethinking Diabetes, and we're going to also continue to look at the early stages of knowledge when it concerns diabetes. Now, it's not that they hadn't learned about diabetes like 1,000 years previously. People had been talking about this mysterious disease that caused people to waste away and caused their urine to taste sweet. And it had been known, but not much was known. And so Gary discusses how they began to realize what was actually going on. For the longest time, they didn't even realize that the pancreas had anything to do with processing carbohydrates and sugars and had anything to do with diabetes at all. So let's just look at how they figured that out. Gary writes about a scientist and his research assistant. The scientist's name was Minkowski, and he was determined to do I think you'd call it a pancreatology, basically to take the pancreas out of a dog. This was research. I don't think they would allow them to do that today to dogs, maybe rats, but in those days you could get by with it. So he did a surgery and took the pancreas out of a dog. And lo and behold, one of his assistants that was helping him his job was, among other things, to take the dog out for a walk so that the dog would pee outdoors. And so the scientist, Minkowski noticed the dog had peed on the floor, and he kind of chewed out his researcher, saying, "Why didn't you take him out? I told you to take him out for a walk." He said, "I did," and he did go pee. He did urinate for a good long while, but when he came back, he urinated some more. And that was unusual because that dog was well trained, was very much house trained. And so he thought, well, isn't that odd? Strange that they would do this terrible surgery to a dog that apparently had been around and was a house dog, but they did. And they finally decided, let's test and see if he's got sugar in his urine, this dog. And sure enough, he did. And Minkowski got interested, and he said, you know what, I'm going to do some more surgeries on dogs. So he found 3 more dogs and did a surgery on each one and removed their pancreas. And lo and behold, they all I think 2 of them died from the surgery and didn't live through it, but one of them lived on. And sure enough, he became diabetic and had the sweet urine. And Minkowski made the statement to his assistant. He says, do you know, he was shocked at this, do you know that all pancreatectomized dogs that have had their pancreas taken out, they all become diabetic. And it was like this was the first time. What year was this? Okay, this was in the 1920s. This was the first time anybody ever figured out that pancreas has anything to do with processing sugar and with diabetes. So after that, it became a race to see what can we do to make up for pancreases that are failing. And they came to an assumption that was actually wrong. They assumed that any diabetic, and every diabetic practically, had a failing pancreas. Well, that's not true. For every type 1 diabetic, they do have a failing pancreas, one that has been destroyed by an autoimmune disease. But type 2 diabetics, most cases, their pancreases are working fine. In fact, they're working overtime. Now, that may not last. They may tax those pancreases so much that eventually it won't last. But usually in those early stages of diabetes, your pancreas is working just fine. Your problem is not your pancreas. A lot of times people think, oh, you're diabetic. Your pancreas doesn't work. You're not producing much insulin. Wrong. In many cases, you're producing much more insulin, your pancreas is, than it should ever have to produce. So Gary makes the statement that diabetologists set out to desugarize the urine in their patients. So they had like one goal. If we can somehow get rid of the sugar in the urine, we fixed you. And when insulin became available and it became known and discovered and started to be used in the late 1920s, I think it was, they thought, we've got the magic weapon. We now know, this was their idea, we now know that diabetes is a problem where your pancreas isn't working well. Just like the dogs, they lost their pancreas and now they're diabetic. We now know what the problem is. Your pancreas isn't working very well, or maybe it's failed entirely, which is true with the type 1, but not with the type 2. So their goal was, is there some way we can desugarize them anyway, even if they have a pancreas that isn't working? And of course, the solution they came up with, once insulin was discovered and they figured out how to give patients insulin, the solution was, let's give them more insulin. Well, more insulin is exactly what the type 1 needs, but not what most type 2 diabetics need. But that became their major goal, is we've just got to get rid of the sugar in the urine and the sugar in the blood. And the way to do that is insulin. And if that doesn't work, we'll give them more insulin and more insulin. And that has not worked for type 2 diabetics at all. Now, Gary goes on to say that in around 1960, there was a revolution among some researchers and scientists and people that study diabetes. There was a revolution, he says, in the understanding of type 2 diabetes. It was not a disorder of insulin deficiency, what they had all assumed. You just don't make enough insulin. You're diabetic? Oh, you poor thing. You don't make enough insulin. Wrong. But he said they finally figured it out, at least some did, in 1960. It was not insulin deficiency, hence of the pancreas, as physicians had assumed since Minkowski. In other words, ever since he pulled the pancreas out of dogs and found out they became diabetic, they just assume it's insulin insufficiency. He said, rather, individuals with this chronic form of diabetes, type 2 diabetics, tend to have too much insulin in their circulation, hyperinsulinemia. And that is so powerful and so important. It's not that they don't have enough insulin. They've got too much already, and yet doctors will often give them more because their number one and only goal is get the sugar down. And if some insulin will help lower it a bit, then more insulin will lower it some more. And if I give a whole bunch of insulin, I will really lower that blood sugar. And while there's some truth to that, it doesn't hardly fix anything because you've got all kinds of problems with hyperinsulinemia and you're becoming more insulin resistant. And after a while, even mega doses of insulin don't work for you anymore, and your pancreas finally plays out. It's a mess. So they began to see that in the case of most type 2s, it's not insulin insufficiency, it is hyperinsulinemia. Now, I was thinking about this as I was studying this, and I thought, when I first started out trying to fix my blood sugar problems, and diabetes was coming at me like a freight train. And all I really had to work with, besides reading a couple of books, was a glucose meter. That's all I had to go with. I wasn't focused on insulin. I didn't think much about it. Now, I did learn some things when I read Dr. Michael and Mary Ead's book, Protein Power, because they talk a lot about insulin and hyperinsulinemia in that book. So I learned some things there, but that was a few years down the line. When I first started out, I'm just testing blood sugar after meals, about an hour after I eat, and finding out which ones spike me. I wasn't even thinking about insulin. And I often encourage people to do that, and I get criticized sometimes. Some people say, well, Dennis, don't you know their problem isn't high blood sugar, their problem is high insulin? Well, first of all, high blood sugar is a problem. And if you've got high blood sugar, it's damaging you every day, especially when you're up around 400 or 500. But also you likely, if you're a type 2 again, not type 1, but if you're a type 2, likely you've got high insulin along with the high blood sugar, and they're coming at you like a 1-2 punch. They're both damaging you. They're both hurting you. Now, when I was trying to fix myself by doing all this testing, that meter, that glucose meter, didn't tell me one single thing about my insulin, nor was I even concerned. What bothered me was when I would jump up to like 180 or 200 after a meal, or 220, and I knew that wasn't any good at all. So I was wanting to lower it. But here's what saved me and helped me so much. As I focused on low-carb eating, which stopped driving my blood sugar up, guess what? My pancreas didn't need to put out much insulin either. I was dealing with both situations without knowing I was dealing with an insulin issue. I wasn't thinking about it at all. I was just thinking about that blood sugar. I don't want a 200. I don't want a 180. I don't want a 160. I want to keep it under 140 and preferably under 130. And I'll just eat the meals and keep it low. I didn't know it at the time, but I was dealing with my high insulin as well. So it's good that these days we know that high insulin or hyperinsulinemia is a big, big problem. But the good news is the same diet that works against high blood sugar, if you're doing it by diet, not just jamming yourself with more insulin, or taking some high-powered med that's going to squeeze your pancreas until it puts out every last drop it can. But instead of doing that, you're dealing with it by diet and by eating maybe 2 meals instead of 3, time-restricted eating, or intermittent fasting, as it's often called. When you're dealing it with diet and time-restricted eating, you're giving a 1-2 punch back at your enemy. And you're dealing with both problems even though you may not know it. You may just be laser focused on that number that shows up on your blood sugar meter. And you're not thinking much about insulin, but you're dealing with that insulin because if you keep those spikes low, your pancreas is going to say, I've got an easy day today. And that's what you want. You won't need to put out much insulin. Your glucose levels will drop, and your A1C will drop, and your fasting blood sugar will drop, and things are going to be looking good for you, my friend. Do you need more information and inspiration about beating diabetes? The very first line of our description is nearly always a link to our hundreds of videos toward that one subject, how to beat diabetes. Click on that link and start watching these videos. You'll be blessed and I believe greatly helped.